Hello again, students. It is I, Benjamin Franklin, returning to share with you some information about my life. It's good to be back with you. Now, this text was written in your time, but I somehow managed to obtain a copy, and it is called The Many Lives of Benjamin Franklin. And it is my pleasure today to share this story with you, as I feel this author, Aliki, has done a wonderful job capturing many of the things about me. I was born with just one life, but as I grew, my curiosity, my sense of humor, and my brilliant mind turned me into a man with many lives. I was born in Boston in 1706. My mother and my father, who was a candle maker, had many children. But they saw that I was special. I was curious, and I loved books. Even as a child, I was filled with bright ideas. Now, the way this author has written this story includes many cartoons and captions, so I shall read those as well. These are some of the 17 children of Josiah and Abiah Franklin. I was the 10th and youngest son. And there I say, 'tis a good thing the table is so big. You can do this work when you grow up. I don't like the smell. And it's true, candle making and soap making is a very, very smelly trade. This was the house on Milk Street where I was born, Milk Street in Boston, and I taught myself to read before anyone even noticed. I was always thinking, even at play. I liked to swim and tried different ways. Once I made paddles so that I could go faster. Another time, when I was flying my kite near a pond, I had another idea. I went for a swim holding on to the kite string. Just as I thought, that kite pulled me across the water. See, I did other things with kites, not just the electricity. My paddles were wooden with a hole for my thumb, and I made paddles for my feet, too. I loved school, but my parents did not have the money for me to continue because, as we talked about, school in my time cost money. After only 2 years, I had to leave and choose a trade. It was decided that I would learn to be a printer like my brother James. So when I was 12, I was sent to live with him. I really wanted to be a sailor so that I could travel. But my mother said, "No, Ben, your brother was a sailor, and he drowned. Since you love books, you can be James's apprentice. He is strict, but you will learn printing." And so that was the apprenticeship that I was sent to. I was sent to be an apprentice with my brother. My job as an apprentice was to clean and sort the type, sweep the floor, and sell the papers. I spent nights and Sundays reading and practicing my writing. I learned quickly. I worked long, hard hours, but still I found time to read every book I could borrow, and I saved the money I earned so that I could purchase more. At the shop, I wanted to do more than just help print my brother's paper. I wanted to write in it, too. So I thought of a way. James began finding mysterious letters under his office door. They were signed, "Silence Dogood." Silence wrote such funny stories, clever essays, and poetry that James printed them. In fact, they helped him sell more newspapers. Little did he know that Silence Dogood was really his little brother, me. Silence Dogood wrote that she was a poor old widow woman with some ideas she wished to share. She said she would write again. James showed the letters to his friends. "I don't know who she is, but I'll print them," he said. "Clever, interesting, funny." Another letter. People could hardly wait for the paper to be printed with the Widow Dogood's next letter. I wrote more and more of these letters. A few years later, I met and married a young girl named Deborah Reed. Deborah also worked hard. She managed our new house, and she ran her own general store next to my print shop. I believe I may have skipped a page. I did indeed. But when James found out, he was angry. I was not allowed to write any more. I decided to go somewhere else, where I could write. So when I was 17, I left James and Boston. I went to Philadelphia to start a life of my own, and I found a job with a printer. I read and collected more books. I worked hard and saved until at last I bought my own shop. Now I could print my own newspaper and all of the letters I wished. I worked very hard and even delivered my packages myself. A few years later, I met and married a young girl named Deborah Reed. Deborah worked hard too. She managed our new house and her own general store next to my printing shop. Before long, we had 2 children to help us. Ben's father, my father, made soap and candles for Deborah to sell. Our children included William, who was the oldest, Francis, who was born in My father made soap and candles for Deborah to sell. My children included William, who was my oldest, Francis, who was born in 1732, but sadly when he was 4, he got very sick and died, and baby Sarah, who I liked to call Sally. My newspaper was a great success. Then I began printing a yearly calendar called Poor Richard's Almanack. That book was full of advice and news and information, and what made it even more special were the wise and witty sayings of Poor Richard. Year after year, people bought my almanac, and it made me famous, well known throughout the colonies. I pretended that Richard Saunders wrote the almanac. Poor Richard was Richard Saunders, an astrologer who liked to spend his time gazing at the stars. My wife nagged me to get to work and make some money, so I decided to please her. That is why I wrote the almanac. But of course that was all fiction, just like Silence Dogood was. The almanac gave weather forecasts, tide changes, astrology news, the right time to plant, sow, and harvest, recipes and cures for ailments, ideas, inventions, news events, and of course Poor Richard's sayings. Some of these are still well known in your time. Sayings like early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Or beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink even a great ship. 'Tis hard for an empty bag to stand upright. Up, sluggard, and waste not life. In the grave will be sleeping enough. A word to the wise is enough. At the working man's house, hunger looks in, but dares not enter. Every little makes a mickle, and 1 today is worth 2 tomorrows. I have many more sayings, but there are only so many pages in this book. Meanwhile, I was busy living other lives. I loved Philadelphia. It was a new city full of promise, and I was there at just the right time. I started a club called the Junto, where friends would meet to discuss books and ideas. Men from many trades came to my weekly Junto meetings. I lent out my books, and soon others began to do the same. This began the first free lending library in America. I found new ways to light the streets and to have them cleaned and paved too. I started a police force, a fire department, a hospital, and an academy. I helped to make laws. Philadelphia became as famous as I was. My portrait still hangs in many fire departments to this day. By the time I was 42 years old, in 1748, I had enough money from my printing to live in comfort with my family. I gave up my shop to spend all of my time with my ideas, and thus a new life began. I started scientific experiments, and soon I became a master. I was the first to prove that lightning was electricity. One day during a thunderstorm, I tried a dangerous experiment with a key, a kite, and I found that I was right. I proved my hypothesis. Then I realized how to protect houses from that lightning and invented the lightning rod. People put Franklin rods up on their rooftops in America and in other countries too. Now, here is my kite experiment, but please do not attempt to replicate it. I would not want any harm to come to you. I attached a pointed metal rod to the top of my kite. I tied a silk cord to the kite string and a key to the silk cord. Then my son William and I took shelter, and lightning struck the rod. When I touched the wet key, I felt a shock, and I knew that electricity had traveled down the kite string into the key, but the silk cord stopped it from going further and electrocuting me. I made many discoveries in my lifetime, but I refused money for them. I believed that my ideas belonged to everyone. I wrote them down, and they were translated into many languages. I became the best-known man in all of the American colonies. I invented the Franklin stove that fit into a fireplace and could heat a whole house. The stoves are used even in your time. I found safer routes for ships to travel. I became the postmaster general and found safer ways to send mail. I designed a chair table. I made a musical instrument called an harmonica, not a harmonica, but an harmonica. It was played by rubbing wet fingers against glass discs, and famous composers even wrote music for it. I experimented in my garden and found better ways to grow crops. I invented bifocal glasses so that I could see far out of the top of the glass and near out of the bottom. I introduced Swiss barley, Chinese rhubarb, Newton apples, willow for baskets, and turnips to America. And I found that black cloth keeps us warmer than white by laying pieces of cloth in the snow, and after some time seeing that the black cloth was warmed by the sun and sank into the snow, while the white cloth did not. And there are illustrations of many of my experiments. I so enjoyed discovering new things. More than anything, I hoped that people would listen to my most important idea, freedom for our country. For at that time, America was an English colony. I, along with others, did not want to be ruled by England any longer. I was sent to England to seek independence for my country. For 18 long years I stayed there, and I worked toward that goal. In 1775, I returned to Philadelphia, sad and disappointed, for I was unsuccessful. My wife, Deborah, had died. War with England had begun, and America was still not free. My friends and I discussed ways to gain freedom for America. William and I left for England. I made many trips back to Philadelphia to visit Deborah and Sally. Deborah did not go with me, for she was afraid of the long and dangerous sea voyage. Yet I persisted. I, along with other great Americans like Thomas Jefferson, wrote the Declaration of Independence. We were determined to be free, but we knew we would first have to fight a long and terrible war. This is a photo or an illustration of the Pennsylvania State House, which is now known as Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed by me, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, John Hancock, and 52 of our contemporaries on July 4th, 1776. And General George Washington led the battles in the Revolutionary War. He was our general during the war. But we needed help. We needed more. I was old and weary when again I was sent away. This time I went to ask for aid from the King of France. You see, France and England hated each other. They were both always struggling for power. So I went to France to see if they would help us fight against England. I was greeted there as a hero. People in France knew all about me and my inventions, and they loved me. Finally, the king agreed. With his help, the war with England was won, and America was free at last. In France, I visited King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. Though everyone wore fancy clothes and powdered wigs, I did not. Everyone was impressed with the inventor's plain clothes and simple ways. In 1781, the war ended. The Liberty Bell in Independence Hall rang out. I had served abroad long enough. I wanted to spend my last years at home. So when I finally returned from France, it was 1785. I thought I had been forgotten. But I was not forgotten. I was greeted with wild celebrations, and I saw that my country still needed me. I became the first governor of Pennsylvania, and I helped to write the Constitution of the United States. On September 13th, 1785, my ship entered Philadelphia harbor. Bells rang, cannons boomed, and hundreds of people waited to welcome me home. I was reunited at last with my daughter Sally, her husband, Richard Bach, and my grandchildren. On September 17th, 1787, myself and the other great writers of the Constitution signed the document on which all laws of the United States are based, even up to your time. I lived for 84 years. I left the world my inventions, my ideas, my wisdom and my wit, and I lived my many lives for you all. I thank you so much for listening to my story today and for learning a bit about my life in the early days of Pennsylvania. Thank you, students. It's been a pleasure.